co-president of the Squirrel Hill Historical Society. Looks like we have a great crowd here tonight. I think we have a very interesting program lined up. And the way we always start this is we'd like to introduce some of our officers and volunteers because this really is a group effort to make this work. And we're very lucky to have some great people that have volunteered over the years, and they pitch in and do whatever it takes to get the job done. Jim Hammond, our other co-president, wasn't able to make it tonight, but our Vice President Helen Wilson is over there. Betty Conley, the other co-vice president, I guess, sitting back there in the middle. We have Evelyn Young, treasurer, which is in the back. Board members, Jeannie Binstock in the back. Toby Chapman, I didn't see him here yet. Audrey Glickman behind the camera there, another board member. And Tony Indovina in the back, he's also a board member and he's our email coordinator. And Stanley Klein, our membership coordinator, is also in the back. Can't forget him. First off, our 2020 membership drive is moving forward. We're still encouraging people to sign up as soon as you can. Our annual membership dues are very reasonable, $15 for individuals and $25 for couples. It's something we really depend on for the organization. And one of the benefits of membership is you receive a monthly newsletter, which looks something like this. And typically they're about 8 pages long and contain information about the organization, information about various things going on in the community, and also several very well-researched historical articles of history of Squirrel Hill, as well as the surrounding area. And it's a very popular, and along with that is a membership renewal form. The membership renewal forms are also in the back table back there. Along with, we have 4 different books for sale in the back. 2 of them are History of Squirrel Hill books put out by our organization, and 2 others are written by members of the Squirrel Hill Historical Society. There's a book about Sophie Masloff, our former mayor, written by Barbara Bursman, who's a member, and also a book called Pockets, written by Audrey Glickman, behind the camera.
Thank you, Wayne.
One thing we've done recently, we changed our email address. And I think we have most of the bugs worked out about that, but we do want to make sure that everyone's able to receive the email, that we have them on our list. So if you've not received a test email recently from Gmail, formerly it was Hotmail, but it's been changed to Gmail, let us know and we'll fix the problem and you'll start receiving our emails. That brings us to tonight's speaker, Tammy Hepps, whose talk is entitled Homestead and Squirrel Hill. Tammy came back to Pittsburgh a few years back, trace her Jewish roots in Homestead. She created a website, homesteadhebrews.com, where she compiled the results of her research. It includes chronologies, records, exhibits, stories, and interactive maps. In her talk, she'll explore the surprisingly symbiotic relationship between Homestead and Squirrel Hill. It started back in the 1890s, and it continues to this day. Homestead and Squirrel Hill, we've traded community and commerce for generations. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Tammy.
see so many of you here. I will try not to indulge your attention spans too much, but this is a topic that is definitely close to my heart, first of all because it's Homestead, and nothing is more important to me than Homestead, but I live in Squirrel Hill. So actually, putting together this talk, I thought I knew what I was going to say coming in, but actually in some ways doing the research has taught me a lot more about where I've been living for the past 5 years than I actually had known previously. So this is the tale of two intertwined communities that were created for the same purpose, but took dramatically different paths. This is a tale about how the things you think you already know about the place that you live look quite different in the context of what might have been. This is a tale about how no place exists independent of its surroundings, but we need to question our assumptions about what those surroundings are, where they begin and end. And in the beginning, there were farms. Through the Civil War and after, both Homestead and Squirrel Hill were sparsely populated areas divided into large farms and estates. We think of both places as being near to downtown Pittsburgh, but given what transportation was in the mid-1800s, both actually had serious accessibility challenges. So we'll look at Homestead first. Here is a view into some of the farms and estates that once made up the southern bank of the Monongahela River at the bend just below 9 Mile Run. So John McClure, who was the first permanent settler of this area, purchased the land after the Revolutionary War, and he and generations of his family farmed it. He called his country seat Amity, or the Amity Homestead, because, quote, no place suited him so well as his homestead, as one account of his life put it. And so his Amity Homestead held on for the better part of a century, even as adjacent areas began to turn industrial. Another place that held on to its rural qualities far longer than its neighbors was Squirrel Hill. For reference, this star, which is going to recur frequently throughout the talk, will always mark the location of Forbes and Murray, neither of which exist at this point in time, but we'll see when that happens. So you can always orient yourself on the map that way. And you'll notice at the bottom of the slide, the bend in the river in Homestead is off screen below that. So in this collage of maps from 1862, you can see what was then Peoples Township, surrounded by already built up areas. East Liberty to the north, Wilkinsburg to the east, what was then called Pitt Township to the west, but Squirrel Hill at this time remained mostly open, a mix of the original farms of the early settlers and newer country estates of wealthy industrialists from downtown Pittsburgh. They mimicked the British and gave their estates names like Viewlands and Highlands to reflect the geography of the landscape. With only a few small industries, salt, coal, stone quarry, and the like, Squirrel Hill was for its residents a respite from the pollution of its more industrialized surroundings. When railroad tracks were laid in the 1850s, the route ran along the flat riverbank all the way to the south. The hill was far too steep for railroad cars to climb. So as a result, this area up here on the hill remained rather remote, just as its residents wanted it. It wasn't even part of Pittsburgh yet. It would be annexed in 1868. But the southern bank of the Monongahela River has quite a different geography, as you've perhaps seen for yourself. Its steep hill is set back about a half mile from the river's edge. So the Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Charleston Railroad announced plans in the early 1870s to build a line set back about a quarter mile from the river, running right through a number of the existing country estates, with a station stop in the vicinity of Amity Homestead. So John McClure's grandson, Abdiel, who was then the scion of Amity Homestead, and the neighboring West family, saw the opportunity for profit from the new train line. They sold their collective holdings to the Homestead Bank and Life Insurance Company, which divided the land into lots that they offered for sale as a future pleasant residential suburb of smoky industrial Pittsburgh. The forthcoming train line would make it easy for residents of Homestead to get back and forth to downtown Pittsburgh. The newspaper advertised what the town would be like. One article in July of 1871 pronounced, quote, "The population of this new suburb will comprise the very choicest element of society. Future residents, quote, can live healthier, happier, and cheaper in such a locality than in the crowded city." Remember that. Although you're laughing, so you already know the irony. Now this one I don't think you know. Another advertisement in September trumpeted, quote, pure water and plenty of it. Remember that. So the date of the first sale, September 9th, 1871, marked the founding of the town of Homestead. So here is the state of affairs in 1872, a year after Homestead was founded. Homestead was divided up into lots, though not much had been built yet. The PV&C Railroad ran right through the newborn town as promised, with a station at what was then the intersection of 6th and Amity. Yes, that street was named after the other half of Amity Homestead, and yes, that is why there is a McClure Street and West Street. Squirrel Hill, on the other hand, see our star came up to show you where we are. Squirrel Hill, on the other hand, was largely unchanged, though the surrounding areas around it were even more built up. In Homestead, the construction of homes on the new lots continued through the 1870s. The Panic of 1873 slowed the pace of development somewhat, so at the end of the decade, there were only probably a couple hundred buildings, at best for its 596 residents. There were no real businesses to speak of and only light industry. It was, in fact, the pleasant suburb it was founded to be. But what ultimately settled the fate of Homestead was not what the West and McClure families did with their holdings, but what their neighbors to the east did. They sold their land to local steel mill companies. The wide, flat riverbank, as well as the train tracks, made it a perfect industrial site. In 1879, the first steel mill started to go up just east of the town. And so this painting from 1884 by William C. Wall, someone had asked that earlier, it shows the initial proximity of the steel mill to the town, which is a little hidden by the trees in this painting. It also gives you a nice view of the different riverbank on the other side of the Mon, the one we're on right now. Squirrel Hill's geography was still protecting it. There was nowhere for heavy industry to build, not along the narrow riverbank, and certainly not atop the steep hill. By 1884, there were a lot more roads running through Squirrel Hill than before. Notably, Murray Avenue had by this time been created, running along its current route. But overall, the area was still quiet and sparsely populated. But as for Homestead, you can see where the square is right away, the cluster of buildings that show the effect that the nearby steel mill was having. The same year as this painting, the Homestead newspaper reflected, quote, in the early days, it was the purpose of property owners and residents here to make Homestead a Sewickley or a Hazelwood, instead of the working man's home. It was for years the most quiet place in the world. Every day seemed Sunday, but that was not to last. The glass house and steelworks came. So what did it mean that Homestead was now, quote, the working man's home? The town was filled with a lot of young, transient working men, disproportionately single, and everything that came with. Within 6 months of the steel mill opening, there were already 19 saloons, with 10 more being built. Saturdays were payday, and Saturday night steel mill workers drank their wages and caroused through town. The paper regularly complained about these scenes. One such evening, for example, the men were, quote, publicly carousing, drinking intoxicated liquors and other immoral practices, indulging in vile and insulting language and vulgar songs. As the need grew for unskilled laborers, the town's immigrant population grew rapidly. At first, the town's paper wondered at all the newcomers, quote, anyone who frequents the public places of this town cannot help but be struck with the number of new and strange faces to be seen and the difference in nationality, manners, and dress. There is a heterogeneousness about our public gatherings which impresses one with the newness of our population. It is made up of people from the four corners and has not become assimilated. However, the long-standing complaints about payday behavior gradually took on xenophobic overtones. Quote, the investigation made by a representative of this paper shows that the infractions of decency are confined to the Hungarian population, mostly residing in the second ward, several hundred being huddled in a few houses. The article goes on to describe the behavior of these, quote, mongrels, concluding, quote, if these things were done by other than Hungarians, it would be a disgrace to the community. They've clearly forgotten that they were, not that long before, and probably still were then. An increase in robberies in the late 1880s required the addition of more policemen to the town. And although the use of archaic euphemisms makes it a little bit hard for me to be sure, I'm pretty sure that the town's famous brothels date to this period as well. So by the end of the decade, the Homestead Steel Mill was the most famous steel mill in the world, and its town forever altered. Meanwhile, across the river, Squirrel Hill was about to get a train of its own. While Homestead lost all traces of its rural roots and suburban dreams, Squirrel Hill survived yet another decade unchanged. Where Homestead prided itself on its, quote, unexampled growth and prosperity, sources suggest that Squirrel Hill residents would have congratulated themselves for remaining separate from all of that. The Pittsburgh Daily Post wrote, quote, Squirrel Hill has always been held sacred by property owners in that district against the division of any part of it into lots. It was cut off from the rest of the city in other ways. Quote, at present, only the wealthy can enjoy the hills of the 22nd and 23rd wards. Those were the ward numbers in those days. With the wards, the garden spot of the city, because only those who can afford private conveyances can get there. But in February of 1889, the Squirrel Hill Railroad Company got approval to build a railroad operated by cables or electricity. You can see the route on the map. It ran right past Colfax, which was a quaint little schoolhouse back then. This route actually never happened. The company ran into almost immediate financial and legal problems, in large part because after Mary Shenley's estate was turned over to the city for a park, the city tore up all the tracks that had already been laid by this company because it did not want a streetcar going through the new park. Sometime in late 1893, the line finally started up, and the dashed route on this map, which hopefully you can make up, it goes right through the star, shows the original route. It passed through the top of the park, it turns down Murray, and then it sort of veers off a little bit higher up than it was originally going to veer off. An amusing side note, which some of you might know, the original Street Railroad Company was auctioned off as part of all of their difficulties, and the new management changed the name to the Shenley Park and Highland Railroad Company. Remember Highland, one of those original farming estates? The paper noted in 1891 that the residents of Squirrel Hill were eager for the railroad to adopt Highland for its name, as the residents were, quote, anxious to have the name of that locality changed. Squirrel Hill they regard as decidedly uneuphemistic. Even before the streetcar was running, it started to overpower its residents' aversion to real estate speculation. The Pittsburgh Daily Post in 1890 quoted one of the directors of the streetcar company. He said, there is one man who owns 100 acres which will be directly enhanced in value by the construction of the road. A year ago, that man could not have given away his land. Recently, he has sold some of it at the rate of $10,000 an acre because the electric road is nearly completed. At that point, only nearly completed. So at this point in our story, Homestead and Squirrel Hill have largely separate existences. But the rapid growth in Homestead created the need for connecting them. So by the early 1890s, Homestead had two different railroads running east-west, but if residents wanted to go across the river, it, quote, requires a sacrifice of time and comfort and a great deal of patience, noted Homestead's paper in 1887, due to the uncertainty of the ferry boats and the inconvenience of the skiff ferries. In August of 1889, Homestead's paper reported application will soon be made for a charter for the Homestead Bridge Company. The construction of the bridge will be of incalculable benefit to Homestead. It will afford rapid communication with the city, but the most important benefit will be the large territory it will make available for building purposes, bringing within quick and easy reach the knolls and slopes of Squirrel Hill and North Homestead. The article goes on, if one is built, it means a big boom for real estate across the river and a boom for the town as well, that is Homestead. For a bridge will turn in this direction a great deal of trade from the other side, which now goes to the city. The truckmen over on Squirrel Hill will come over to Homestead because they will find a more convenient and ready market than they now have, and the town will have a better and fresher supply. So note the Homestead-centric point of view here. That it was Homestead that had everything to gain from this bridge, more living space for the people working in its steel mill, more trade from Squirrel Hill residents, more fresh produce from Squirrel Hill's farmers. In fact, their point of view was that Squirrel Hill's residents and farmers needed Homestead for trade. And at that time, most people would have agreed with them. Squirrel Hill was a place that people passed through on the way to somewhere else. The Squirrel Hill point of view was that they could provide upscale housing for Homestead steel mill managers. This differed slightly from Homestead's view on the real estate issue, which was that it was the workers who needed somewhere to go. So as you can see from this bar graph, Homestead's population had grown 13-fold from 1880 to 1890. Squirrel Hills had only increased by 50%. So now Homestead had 2.5 times as many people as Squirrel Hill, plus an industry that was attracting more and more. And a commercial district that made the town self-sufficient. Just look at the dramatic growth of local businesses in Homestead so far. Meanwhile, Squirrel Hill had only a few isolated grocers and ice houses. Homestead was a place where residents could easily get the things that they needed. It was by far the largest town on its side of the river in the valley, drawing people from miles away, although it did have this perennial housing shortage. So all indicators at the time suggested that growth in Homestead, in every respect, would continue unabated. I show these two different graphs, first the population, now this showing the differences in businesses, to remind us that these communities are not only places where people lived, but they're also places where people either could or could not earn their livelihoods. Which is to say that in the 1880s, Squirrel Hill might have been the more pleasant place to live, but only for a very few. Squirrel Hill was not a place with local employment opportunities. Squirrel Hill was not a place where people could shop locally. These graphs show that even as the population grew over the decade, local businesses did not keep pace. Homestead was, at that time, the community with many more opportunities for many more classes of people. In an era before any kind of public transportation, let alone automobiles and disposable income, all of this movement was a luxury. Steelworkers, both managers and unskilled laborers, lived within walking distance of the mill. Many shopkeepers of this era lived above their stores. Without refrigeration, housewives bought food multiple times per day at the corner store. So better off homesteaders could shop in downtown Pittsburgh, but most had to rely on local shops. And so when you look at these two graphs together, both the population and number of businesses, you realize that all of these factors are feeding into each other in Homestead. So today for us it's quite common to live and work in different places, live and work and shop, I should say, in different places. But keep in mind as we go that we're talking about a dramatically different era from our own. Think of both the residential opportunities and the livelihood earning opportunities of each of these places, and how historical development will then alter each of these opportunities. So back to the bridge. By the end of 1890, the project was announced. Quote, an electric road, the paper said, will be run out from the city over Squirrel Hill and down to the river at the Salt Works, what will cross the river to Homestead. The bridge came to be called Sam Brown's Bridge, after the Captain Sam Brown who initiated the project. Then came all the many streetcar delays and a lot of other things, but finally, in mid-1890, Sam Brown started to advance his project, though no one believed him. In the paper, they called it his mythical bridge. Nor did anyone actually trust the streetcar company either, after their many years of fits and starts. But Sam Brown was finally building his bridge. And at the same time, the streetcar company rushed ahead on its part of the streetcar route that would run through Homestead. And then there was also this major consolidation of streetcar routes that would now connect Homestead to all different parts of Pittsburgh and to all the significant surrounding towns. So it was a very exciting time. As an aside, to correct the record, Sam Brown did not own the street rail company. His economic incentive in building the bridge was just to collect the tolls. So the bridge opened March 1st, 1895. The Homestead paper reported, the bridge is the main link which closes the electrical connection between Greater Homestead and Greater Pittsburgh, of which the territory thus opened up is to be the garden spot of a vast city. The Pittsburgh Daily Post reported something rather different. They said, Homestead was informally annexed to the Greater Pittsburgh yesterday by the opening of the bridge. And if you ask me more questions about that, I had to cut some material for time, but the story is actually a lot better than that. So the lines went into operation a month later. And so the dashed line on this map, which again runs through that star, you can see it on either side, shows the expanded route of the streetcar running straight down Murray and beyond to the new bridge, which is down at the bottom here. And just to make sure folks are clear, this is the old Browns Hill Bridge. It is not what connects Homestead and Squirrel Hill today. The bridge today is this one, the Homestead High Level Bridge, which was opened in 1937, and then the old bridge was subsequently demolished. Okay, so we're now all the way up to the year 1895. And the dream of a pleasant residential suburb, this dream that gave birth to Homestead a quarter century prior, was still unfulfilled. Squirrel Hill had held off all this time from any further development, making it really the last territory where such a place could be built in proximity to downtown Pittsburgh. So now with the streetcar and the bridge, the territory was ready to be opened up to more than just wealthy industrialists who could support large estates. So the expected real estate boom in Squirrel Hill seemed to get off to a fast start. The Pittsburgh Daily Post reported some months after the bridge and streetcar lines went into operation that the Squirrel Hill district continues to be the best-selling property in the city, and a number of deals are on foot whereby more desirable building lots will be thrown onto the market within the next few weeks. A year and a half after the bridge opening, though, the Post was still predicting changes that hadn't come. Quote, Squirrel Hill presents in many respects the appearance of the backwoods. This soon will pass away before the enterprises of the real estate agent and public improvements. Then the old houses, some of them that have outlived a century, the dirt roads, the virgin forests, the beautiful fields, all these will be swept away. A year after that, though, the expected boom still hadn't happened. What it took to begin to make Squirrel Hill desirable, beyond the initial streetcar connection, was local improvement projects like Beechwood Boulevard, the grading and paving of roads, the laying of water pipes. It also took more streetcar work so that you could connect Squirrel Hill with downtown Pittsburgh on only one fare. So from 1890 to 1900, Squirrel Hill grew 178% to 1,500 residents, but its landscape actually hadn't changed much. So this map from 1903 to 1906, which begins to, at least by streets, look somewhat recognizable to us. It gives a sense of the pace of change. The dots that you see along with Forbes and Mary show the continued expansion of the streetcar route. You can see that many of the original large plots of land have been broken up into small lots. These are all the rectangles you can make out. But it's the small pink and yellow rectangles that you want to look for. Those are where there are buildings. And so if you look closely, you'll see that there actually aren't a lot of buildings. It's mostly lots that have been divided, and that's as far as it's gotten. So most of Squirrel Hill at this time would have looked wide open to a person passing through. This article explained that great care was being taken in developing the neighborhood. Quote, the property along the principal streets was secured by men whose foresight led them to enforce strict building regulations in making sales, and this has become the invariable rule. The effect of the carefulness that has been exercised in this respect is one of the most pronounced features of the hill. Slowly, small sections of Squirrel Hill began to take on the character of a residential neighborhood, and we begin to see ads not just for lots, but now homes already built on lots. So here are a couple of examples of such ads from 1904 editions of the Jewish Criterion, which was Pittsburgh's Jewish newspaper at the time, which largely was read by Pittsburgh's prosperous German Jewish community. So from this period onward, we see Squirrel Hill's real estate developers making specific efforts to attract Jewish residents to this new neighborhood. The early advertisements in the Criterion paved the way for other real estate companies to recognize the upwardly mobile Jewish community as a ready audience for news of Squirrel Hill real estate opportunities. And in fact, starting in early 1904, the Criterion began to publish notices of Pittsburgh's most prominent Jewish families moving to Squirrel Hill with more and more every year. To give you a sense of the pace and the completeness of the migration in this period, the Criterion noted subsequently that by the end of 1913, 95% of the members of the Concordia Club, which was the most prestigious Jewish organization in Pittsburgh, 95% of them had moved in or about the Squirrel Hill section, as they put it. They were just part of the wealthy class of businessmen and professionals who were moving in, but they established Squirrel Hill's Jewish character from the very beginning of Squirrel Hill's new life as a residential neighborhood, and they signaled to striving Jews across the region that Squirrel Hill was a goal worth attaining. So this map from 1910 shows this center part of Squirrel Hill starting to fill in. By this point, there are very few areas in this vicinity that haven't been subdivided into lots, though of course, as you can see, there's still many open lots. So Squirrel Hill's population more than doubled between 1900 and 1910 to 13,000 people. And in late 1909, the Homestead paper noted that what they called the Murray Avenue section of Squirrel Hill was building up remarkably fast. The addition of apartment houses marked a shift in the neighborhood's real estate strategy thus far, and ultimately the range of residents that it would attract. Note, though, that in 1910, where that red rectangle is, there were just 2 lonely buildings on Murray, and Forbes had only 2 churches and an inn. And there were still relatively few local businesses. We get all the way up to 35 in 1910. Homestead's local paper described the state of affairs. Quote, residents of Squirrel Hill now have to depend almost entirely for household supplies on East End, Oakland, and downtown stores, and are often inconvenienced by delayed deliveries. For the first time, the number of merchants ticked upwards, as you can see on the graph. We're adding pharmacies, grocers, butchers, and the like. So far, these are not Jewish merchants. In late 1908, there was this announcement. This is from the Homestead paper. They wrote, "After a long wait, Squirrel Hill is at last to have a business district. It will comprise the square on the south side of Forbes Street, extending from Murray Avenue to Shady Avenue. The aim is to give Squirrel Hill a strictly high-class shopping district. From now on, the hill will have a growing store district of its own, one which in time is likely to become a very important factor in the further development of the hill as a residential locality." The location was chosen in part because it ran along the trolley route and at that point wasn't built up. Though keep in mind, this announcement postdated the trolley by 18 years because it took that long to get a critical mass of people in the vicinity that you could even have a business district. So this is a much, much slower pace of growth than what we saw in Homestead at a similar stage in its own development. So those two lonely buildings that I showed you on that previous map, that was from 1910, that was the beginning of the Murray Avenue business district. And so we have apartment buildings, we have shops, and so a new round of change is on its way to Squirrel Hill. But to put those changes back in context, we're going to head back to Homestead and see what's been going on there. So Homestead experienced a real industrial boom for much of the aughts. An expansion of its current steel mill and the addition of additional industries, which brought, again, more growth in every area. New stores were opening, new tracts of land went on the market for commercial and residential development, new buildings were going up everywhere, new streetcar lines, new railroad lines were linking Homestead to anywhere you might want to go. The town's population soared, but it was attracting a very different class of person from Squirrel Hill. As this ad puts it, an army of 5,000 workmen means a population of at least 15,000 people. The grocer, the butcher, the baker, and a host of other tradespeople must be there to supply them with what they need. And indeed, it was workmen and tradesmen who made up the bulk of who was living in Homestead. Areas like Superintendent's Row, where the mill managers lived in fancy homes, were very much the exception. The bulk of the residents ranged from working class to absolutely impoverished. Even with these other new industrial establishments, most men still worked for the steel mill, and the rest of the people mostly served the town steel workers in some way, making the town entirely dependent on the steel mill. Homestead, at the same time, had become a place of tremendous dysfunction. For one thing, Homestead, at this point, when I'm referring to it, I'm actually talking about three distinct boroughs. Homestead, West Homestead, and Munhall, which hopefully you can make out that red line dividing them. This was a bit of intentional tax gerrymandering on behalf of the industrial establishments. Munhall Borough contained 3/4 of the steel mill property at that time. West Homestead Borough contained Meston Machine, Keystone Car Wheel Company, Harvest and Walker Brick Company, Howard Axle Works, which was part of Carnegie, and Schiffler Bridge Works. The corporations controlled their respective boroughs on either side, keeping the tax rate there very low for their own benefit, and there they stayed on top of public works projects. But Homestead Borough in the center, which had by far the largest population and most of the poorest people, had to have the highest tax rates of the three in order to make up for the local industrial establishments evading the responsibility to the workers. The residents of Homestead were impoverished with little hope for change. The steel mill workers had not had a union to represent them since it was broken in the famous strike of 1892. The daily wages of the highly skilled workers at Homestead shrunk by 1/5 between 1892 and 1907, while their work shifts increased from 8 hours to 12 hours. The wages of the least skilled workers were below what was considered poverty level of the day, even though they too worked 12-hour shifts and had no time for any self-improvement. Social worker Margaret Byenting, who'd spent a year living in Homestead in 1907 to 1908, wrote about the living conditions, about the large number of residents who were immigrants from Eastern Europe and endured the worst conditions. And she brought with her a photographer, which is where some of these photographs are from that I'm going to show you. She wrote, "From the cinder path beside one of the railroads that crosses the level part of Homestead, you enter an alley bordered on one side by stables and on the other by a row of shabby 2-story frame houses. The doors of the houses are closed, but dishpans and old clothes decorating their exterior mark them as inhabited. Turning from the alley through a narrow passageway, you find yourself in a small court, on 3 sides of which are smoke-grimed houses, and on the 4th, low stables. The open space teems with life and movement. Children, dogs, and hens make it lively underfoot. Overhead, long lines of flapping clothes must be dodged. A group of women stands gossiping in one corner, awaiting their turn at the pump, which is one of the only 2 sources of water supply for the 20 families who live here. Another woman dumps the contents of her wash tubs upon the paved ground, and the greasy, soapy water runs into an open drain a few feet from the pump. In the center, a circular wooden building with 10 compartments opening into one vault, flushed only by this wastewater, constitutes the toilet accommodations for over 100 people. 27 children find in this crowded brick-paved space their only playground. For the 23 rooms in the houses about the court shelter a group of 20 families, Polish, Slavic, and Hungarian, Jewish, and Negro. The men are unskilled workers in the mills. This court is one of many such in Homestead. Accumulations of rubbish and broken brick pavements render the courts as a whole untidy and unwholesome. The houses are built close to the street with only this busy court behind. Dreary as is the exterior, however, the evils to the dwellers in the court lie deeper in the inadequate water supply, in meager toilet facilities, and in overcrowding. In these pictures, yes, I'm focusing on the worst conditions in Homestead, but they were fairly widespread. And as I'll show you now, Homestead's political dysfunction created numerous problems that affected everybody, including those who could afford to live better. Nothing seemed to work in Homestead. The town had a notoriously inefficient, if not outright corrupt, borough council. The liquor laws were not enforced, unlicensed speakeasies were tolerated, and brothels did business with minimal interference. Homestead, in fact, became famous for its vice district, and the police were bribed to look the other way on everything. The people of Homestead were largely unable to demand better representation. For the most part, they were just busy trying to make ends meet, too familiar with American democracy or the English language, or too hesitant to speak up in a town where protest was repeatedly squashed. This was one of the after effects of the 1892 strike, the repression of organizing and activism. A famous quote from the time goes, "If you want to talk at Homestead, you talk to yourself." The conditions took the spirit out of everybody. As we move into the teens, especially as the population increased due to increased production around World War I, we see a significant increase in crime. The town's demographics shifted then too. Homestead's African-American population grew as people migrated up from the South. Mexican immigrants started coming in at this time as well to work in the steel mill, and this change was not easily absorbed. There was, in fact, police violence against these newcomers. I did this research in the summer of 2016, and it really felt like the kinds of news that we were reading that summer, about 100 years prior. The problems with Homestead's governments affected the lives of its residents in more serious ways than the inability to quell lawlessness. What good the Borough Council tried to do, like easing overcrowding or checking the quality of milk from local dealers, they were hard-pressed to make a real difference with their limited efforts against the prevailing conditions. But what affected everyone was the quality of the town's public services, from basic services like garbage disposal, to safety issues like street crossings across the railroad tracks, to quality of life issues like playgrounds. Whether because of indifference, incompetence, corruption, or all three, significant public health problems that affected everyone, even the better off, festered for decades. So, as one example, I'm going to discuss the issue of water in depth. For those homes that had plumbing, and a lot did not at this time, the water that came through the plumbing came from the heavily polluted Monongahela River. As a result, all residents, even the better off, had to boil and filter their water. Many would only drink from wells, which sometimes led to typhoid outbreaks due to the ill-considered location of the wells. Even as sewers and plumbing spread, the council was not able to sort out the problems of water quality and supply. The water would sometimes be shut off for days at a time for repairs that never seemed to hold for long. Once a fire raged out of control during an outage because there was literally no water to fight the fire. In the part of the town on the hill, the pressure was often insufficient. Sometimes only mud would come out of the faucet. People didn't feel clean after bathing. It ruined their clothes and aggravated their skin. In fact, the state government twice condemned Homestead for its water quality and threatened punishment, but was never able to follow through. The example headlines that you're looking at here cover more than 2 decades. The problem started around the turn of the century. For nearly a quarter century, the Borough Council sometimes worked on the issue and sometimes did not. As we'll soon see, their long-standing impotence in the face of such a serious health and quality of life issue would create other side effects. But it's important to remember that we need to look at Homestead from the business angle as well, and here Homestead fares better. Homestead was the market for all 3 boroughs and for the whole surrounding area, which, as we mentioned, was connected to Homestead by streetcars. So the local businesses made available the full range of products and services that people could need or want. So from the 1890s, there was a Businessmen's Association, and in 1911, a new group, the Home Trading Association, which created home trading days multiple times per year, in which the merchants coordinated sales and promotional efforts to encourage people to patronize local stores instead of traveling into Pittsburgh. Starting in 1907, the merchants also organized a big Halloween parade with a costume contest and prizes that drew in tens of thousands of people from all over the region. So twice a year, the usual fall and spring openings of the women's clothing and millinery shops brought people out en masse, as did the annual lead up to Christmas. And so all in all, Homestead had a bustling shopping district that drew people to the town to shop, to live, and to run stores. And its main shopping thoroughfare, 8th Avenue, still wasn't entirely built up. There was still room for Homestead to grow. Now, the red that you see at the bottom here is Squirrel Hill, and we thought that that 35 was impressive, but in the context of Homestead, it's nothing. You can see how much growth that there was of businesses in Homestead through 1919. Note especially the boom years in the early aughts, then the slow developing setback around the Panic of 1907, which persisted until World War I began in Europe in 1914, and then led to increased steel production in Homestead and the whole US. So you can see there's a huge difference here in commercial activity between the two places. If we look at population, we see that in the teens, Squirrel Hill's population grew another 165%, though it still lags well behind Homestead's, which also grew, but not by quite as much as it had before. So with the 4 decades of data that we've seen so far in these graphs, hopefully this helps you to understand Squirrel Hill's early development in a new perspective. It was slow to develop here, especially in the area of business activity. Homestead boomed within the space of a decade after the steel mill came in, but here the net effects of the trolley were very slow to materialize. So despite the bridge that connected them since 1895, Squirrel Hill and Homestead were largely running on parallel tracks in this period. They were two very different places, a quiet residential suburb and a bustling mill town evolving to meet two very different needs. Despite their proximity, it may seem artificial at this stage to compare them to each other because they had so little in common, and they had such different self-perceptions and such markedly different ambitions for what they wanted to be. But that started to change in the teens and accelerated thereafter. You'll recall that when the bridge was built, Homestead believed that all the benefit would be for itself. Homestead believed that the housing shortage for its workers could be solved by development on the other side of the river in Squirrel Hill. But Squirrel Hill, as we've seen, did not become a community for workers, and that largely, and the workers were who was affected by Homestead's perennial housing shortage. So instead, the people who were moving out of Homestead to Squirrel Hill matched the kind of person that we're already seeing in Squirrel Hill. Here are a couple of articles from the Homestead newspaper. We see a judge moving, we see a steel mill official moving, and they're moving to large, expensive homes north of Forbes. Squirrel Hill knew who they wanted to target. This 1910 advertisement in Homestead's newspaper advertises Squirrel Hill as the suburb for Homestead people. It did attract some, but at this time, really not that many. What really got people moving from Homestead to Squirrel Hill was only partly the pull of the suburb, now that the suburb was beginning to have enough businesses and local organizations to be attractive. It was also the push of the lower quality of life in our favorite dysfunctional steel town. Remember the water issues? They came up again and again when people were talking about why they weren't living in Homestead or why they were leaving Homestead. So in this article here, a woman reports, "We had a guest during our worst water famine. About once a day, a decoction of mud was turned on, and to say I was ashamed of our town at that time is putting it mildly." In another article, a woman who lives in Clairton says, "Just as soon as Homestead has better water, I expect to make my home there." Another article from a leading Homestead resident and real estate agent, he says, quote, "Within the last month, I've come in contact with 3 Homestead citizens who have purchased property on Squirrel Hill. When asked the reason for moving, they all voluntarily and with one accord said, water." There were a lot of other things going on in Homestead, as I described earlier. There was ethnic and socioeconomic diversity at a time that was fairly xenophobic. There was rising crime. There was entrenched vice and corruption. There were dirty streets. There was air and noise pollution. There were a lot of reasons to live somewhere else if you could afford to, and maybe not a lot that people would have confessed to, but water people were willing to say. So if we check in on the map of Squirrel Hill at this time, you can see by all these pink rectangles that were the central part of Squirrel Hill. This map doesn't really render very well, but you can see all the pink. Those are all the buildings that are now filling up central Squirrel Hill. And now significant construction is happening in Squirrel Hill South. So as for Squirrel Hill real estate began to increase in Homestead's newspaper in the early 20s, we see an increasing number of reports of Squirrel Hill real estate doings. The Homestead paper was also very happy to report on crime in Squirrel Hill, the lack of police, the lack of streetlights. But by 1922, enough Homestead families had made the move that the town's newspaper took note. This article says, former homesteaders living in the Squirrel Hill district now contemplate forming a homestead club. There are perhaps 100 families, formerly residents of Homestead, now living on streets adjacent to the top of Browns Hill. Some moved there by preference, others moved to the city because of necessity, because they could not get accommodations in Homestead. Reflecting both the demand and the geography of this new outpost of homesteaders, the Homestead Daily Messenger went on sale at a newsstand at Hazelwood and Mary shortly after that. And in the beginning of 1903, in the local news sections where they report on other communities, they begin to have a Squirrel Hill section, where they report on the doings of former residents now living in Squirrel Hill. I should note that Squirrel Hill wasn't the only destination for people who didn't want to live in Homestead proper. There was a lot of movement of people moving south from Homestead into some of the suburbs in that direction. One of those suburbs was even advertised as, quote, the Squirrel Hill district of Homestead. The research to trace the paths of all the Homestead residents who moved to Squirrel Hill is doubly out of scope for me. But I'll tell you a little bit about the early Jewish residents who moved there. So this map shows where the 6 Jewish families who moved there in the 19-teens settled. You'll forgive the fact that the underlying map is anachronistic. 376 was not there at the time, I assure you. Also, if you note the red, I put in the actual bridge location because, of course, the bridge that's shown is not the bridge that was there. We have Clara Segelman moving there. She is a widow who ran a jewelry store for years. She moved there when she retired with her daughter. We have Hyman Podolsky, who is the father of a young family. He was a wholesale jeweler with a store in the Hill. We have Joseph Lasteski, who was an established merchant in Homestead. He moved in with his 2 newly married sons who followed him into the business. He's one of these people you come across when you do this history that you think history is not fair, because I'm sure he thought at that time that he'd be in every history book and no one knows who he is today. He was very significant in Homestead's Jewish community. He was also an early president of Beth Shalom and responsible for building the first building there. If you know any Lasdays, they're Lasteski descendants. We have H.L. Little, a young shoe merchant. Yes, he's part of those Littles. He did have a store in Homestead. It's not the Littles that's there today. We have Charles Frankel, one of my favorite people to research, a fellow Harvard graduate. He was a newlywed lawyer. He worked in Homestead. He lived in Squirrel Hill. We have Albert Gross, one of the first Jewish families to move to Squirrel Hill. He had one of the largest department stores then in Homestead. And then we have newlyweds Fanny Sigel and John Robbins. He was a traveling salesman. When he got sick, she later ran a store in Homestead for a long time. None of them were merchants in Squirrel Hill. There were also prominent merchants in Homestead who had stores in Homestead, but lived in Squirrel Hill, never having lived in Homestead. The Half brothers, who had a furniture store, they were one such family, and Jacob Little, H.L.'s brother, was another one. So that 6 transplanted Jewish Homestead households in the teens, and then in the 20s we get to 65. You can see them on this map. To be clear, these aren't all the Homestead-originated families at this time, it's just those that moved there in 1930. Again, anachronistic map, I added in the real bridge. So you can see that all but 2 of these are in Squirrel Hill South, and in fact one of the households north of Forbes is actually an orphaned young woman who's boarding with another family. So these are all people moving into the new homes and apartment buildings that are coming up south, and these kinds of homes that they're moving into reflect Homestead's housing shortage. These are options that didn't exist in Homestead. They're a mix of all different kinds of families moving in, no sort of obvious pattern. I also included Ward 15, some of the greenfield houses, just to show you the extent of people who were living on the lower part of the hill in proximity to Homestead. In many cases, these families were people who retained their Homestead connections, whether businesses, synagogue membership, friendships, or family. The pins that are blue as opposed to the pins that are purple. The pins that are blue are people who retained their synagogue membership. To be clear, not all the purple people even had a synagogue membership to begin with, so you really do see a lot of people who move, but they still remain connected in a very real way to where they came from. And in fact, from 1951 on, more than half of the members of the synagogue in Homestead actually lived in Pittsburgh, primarily in Squirrel Hill. So if you note this one block, here's a map from 1939. You can see 4 families: Hepps, Feinberg, Moss, and Forkosh. All of these are big synagogue families living about as far down on the hill as you can in proximity to Homestead. So you see that people are not moving to Squirrel Hill because they want to leave everything about Homestead. Ultimately, the movement of Homestead's Jews out of Homestead and into Pittsburgh was complete, but in the early years there was a lot of back and forth. Even a few of these people that I have on the map returned to Homestead not long after this. I suspect the Great Depression was probably a factor. 1930 was not a great time to move on up. And so what we see are these Jews of Homestead, of whom I showed you the examples, are part of the larger migration of homesteaders who were drawn to Squirrel Hill in the 20s and after. So we see that Squirrel Hill's population doubles in the 20s, from the teens to the 20s in the middle of this bar graph, with the construction boom in more modest housing south of Forbes, in the erection of large apartment buildings like the Morrow Field and L Tower. And so for the first time, Squirrel Hill's population surpasses that of the Homestead District. Squirrel Hill's growth slows in the following decade, so it's really the 20s that were the defining decade for population. And this was the decade where we begin to see the Jews of the Hill moving into Squirrel Hill. It's not something that I've researched, but it would be really interesting for someone to take a look at all the different places, not just Homestead, not just the Hill, where people are coming into Squirrel Hill. We know that it was the prosperous German Jews who started the Homestead, who sort of set the tracks for all of the Jews to recognize that Squirrel Hill was a place where Jews could live and thrive. But it would be interesting to see how far out that effect extended, because of course a person could leave Homestead but still not be far from Homestead, which is different from other steel towns. So you'll probably want to see another one of those awesome business graphs, but that data set does not exist after 1919. So a couple of us have been chatting. We have some ideas about how to kind of recreate something like that, but it doesn't exist right now, so I can't show you a bar graph. I would have guessed that what we're seeing is extreme growth in the 20s and 30s that about matches Homestead's peak from a little bit earlier. But the 20s and 30s we do know are when Squirrel Hill's business district begins to assume the form that we know it today after a delayed start and very slow initial growth. So the seeds were set in the early teens with the establishment of Forbes and the more sort of organic development we saw on Mary. The tremendous population growth created enough local need, and the influx of Jews and others supplied the local merchants and salespeople who were needed to run those businesses. There actually were not a lot of Jews from Homestead who moved their businesses. The Ben Little's shoe store, which moved in the 30s, is one of the rare exceptions. That Little's closed when he died. The Little's that survives today is actually an offshoot of what was called Victor's Shoes in Homestead. But these are very much the exceptions. I also just want to point out that it wasn't just Homestead residents moving to Squirrel Hill to live. It was also Squirrel Hill residents and other Pittsburgh residents commuting to work in Homestead. I'm a little distrustful of some of the data that went into this graph, but this shows you how many people were indicated in the Homestead city directories over the years as living in Pittsburgh, but working in Squirrel Hill. So make of it what you will, it at least demonstrates that in every period you have hundreds of people who don't live in Homestead but work there, and so that's another kind of migration that we're seeing. So now both places are places where people can work, where people can live, and so people's relationships to these places are becoming more multifaceted. It took decades, but the bridge is now doing a version of what had been predicted all the way back in the 1890s. So the next chapter in our story focuses on the great American pastime, which came to define both communities. By the middle of the 20th century, both places had thriving shopping districts. For Squirrel Hill, I'm not going to go into this too much because it's pretty well known, and I suspect a lot of you were there. You saw the stores, you know how all of Pittsburgh came to Squirrel Hill to shop, but I'll catch you up on Homestead. I know some of you here were there too. But it's probably less well known how the dire, impoverished steel town had improved in the 30s and 40s and 50s. So we're going to start with this redlining map from the 1937. So you'll note at the bottom that most of Homestead is in red, and you'll note that most of Squirrel Hill is blue or green. That both reflected what was there and ensured what was to come. So it was called a slum, Homestead, but the people who were there, including my family, do not remember it that way. Years later, one woman who lived there said, "No way, it was not a slum. I resented that when I read it in the papers. I was shocked beyond belief. My neighbors all had nice furniture and kept their yards clean. You saw no graffiti or trash outside. The people were clean people who had pride in their yards. By then, the water problem had been fixed. Pittsburgh City Main was connected with Homestead's water pipe system, and Homestead stopped drawing its water from the Gross River. So here you go, a connection between the two places that you might not have known about. By the way, it was the crusading action of the town's newspaper editor that made the difference in this case. The editor was Bert F. Klein, a Jewish resident of Greenfield. You may recognize the name. His son, Bert Klein Jr., became the editor of the Squirrel Hill News. Bert Klein Sr. would not let up on the water issue, and he single-handedly created the pressure that forced the Borough Council to finally act. The next significant change that we see in Homestead is that after many decades, the union is able to return. This is a combination of the Great Depression creating the 1933 National Industrial Recovery Act, and then the 1935 National Labor Relations Act, which requires businesses to bargain in good faith with any union that's supported by the majority of their employees. So you'll note that this article from the paper only includes photographs of disinterested workers who were shying away from the literature being handed to them. But the union was back, collective bargaining was back, and steelworkers slowly began to make their way into the middle class with their fair wages and more reasonable hours. By the middle of the 1950s, the median income of Homestead was 26% higher than the rest of the county. So here is a picture of Homestead in the late 30s. That's still Brown's Bridge. You can see the steel mill at this point is on the side, and the town is on the flat part of the river, and you can't quite make it out, but there are railroad tracks, which we talked about, which run through the middle of those houses. So at the same time that the union was reestablishing itself and beginning to improve the lives of those who worked in the steel mill, Homestead suffered a serious blow. As a result of World War II, there was a decision made to expand the steel mill in the town. The argument was made that this whole lower area of the town was irretrievably blighted, so it made it easy to convince authorities that it would be no great loss just to tear out the entire bottom part of the town, which is what they did. And this whole neighborhood below the train tracks, 121 acres of it was demolished in the early 40s. More than 8,000 people, or 1,566 families were uprooted. So there was no more slum because they simply tore it out. And there actually were a lot of tremendous problems with the displaced workers. There was not enough housing for them. Those problems were especially pronounced for black workers. But there was no more slum. The last major change was the crackdown on vice and corruption that had rampant in the town for decades. A Pittsburgh grand jury began investigating this in 1950. The town's Burgess, that's what they called their mayor, the Burgess was indicted for corruption, not the first Homestead Burgess to run that gauntlet, but this time along with 28 others, including the police chief, the fire chief, and 3 policemen. The grand jury found that Homestead represented, quote, the poorest and the weakest example of public responsibility that has come to our notice. This time, the conviction stuck and Homestead went clean. So we see in the 50s there are 300 stores for 53,000 shoppers coming in from all over the region. A steelworker from this period reflected, quote, Homestead was like when you went to Coney Island, a lot of fun, a lot of money around, a lot of music, a lot of noise. Everybody was just having a good time. 8th Avenue was a lot like Broadway. I lived on Broadway. You could go there at 3 o'clock in the morning and it would be full. People were loaded into the ice cream stores, the saloons. Another worker recalled, quote, you took baths on Saturday night and then you went down to the avenue. On Saturday nights in Homestead, you couldn't even walk on 8th Avenue, couldn't even get on the sidewalks. There were so many people. So the same way that Squirrel Hill was a shopping destination for Pittsburgh, Homestead was a shopping destination for the Valley. The only difference is that Homestead remained dependent on the steel mill. And while the 1950s were a golden age, we all basically know that that was actually the last hurrah. So it might seem like at this point both communities are riding high. Industry in Pittsburgh was booming post-war, and with the union, money was flowing into everybody's pockets. But both places, local leaders detected concerning trends that would affect the long-term viability of their communities. Despite the promising business situation, in the mid-50s, Homestead was concerned with rapidly decreasing population, mostly due to, I don't know, tearing down half your town, and also a sharply declining number of stores. In 1954, there were 1/3 as many stores as there were in 1939. However, there was the same amount of spending, so every store was making a lot more money than it had been, but it was certainly a dramatic crash in the number of stores. So they put together a master plan to reverse blight and make the community more livable. For example, this was only their 6th decade of trying to figure out the playground situation. So their plan would have involved dramatically reconfiguring the town, turning much of the 8th Avenue business district into parking lots and apartment buildings for the hordes of people that they imagined would come flooding back. Also, I don't know if you can read this, they anticipated a heliport in the middle of 8th Avenue. They also, when they took a look at the borough's finances, suggested it would be a great idea if the borough ran its own water, because they clearly remembered nothing from a generation prior. The good news is they did nothing in the plan. The bad news is they also did nothing. So the business district went into a decline in the 60s. The steel industry, of course, went into a decline in the 70s. The mill closed in 86. So the people who could leave left. Section 8 housing came in. Today there are restaurants and coffee shops lining 8th Avenue and fun bars and entertainment venues, but the character of the neighborhood on the hill is largely unchanged from what it was at that time. Squirrel Hill had probably twice as many stores as Homestead in the middle of the last century, but that number declined 20% in the 50s, so they were also looking at some changes. Urban renewal came late to Squirrel Hill because, like so much else, the neighborhood deterioration started later. Failed urban renewal projects in the Hill and East Liberty had affected the Jewish community elsewhere, so here in Squirrel Hill they knew they had to take their own fate into their own hands before it got too late. So the Squirrel Hill Urban Coalition, or SHUC, was founded in 1972 to get ahead of the problems. In fact, it grew out of the Urban Affairs Foundation of the United Jewish Federation, which wanted to investigate the physical and social deterioration in Squirrel Hill. They wanted to prevent Jewish flight to the suburbs by making sure the neighborhood remained livable for everybody. And SHUC really was an effort to bring in all of Squirrel Hill and not just the 45% of people at that time who were Jewish. So the first president, Ed Grinberg, who, as an aside, was the son of 2 Jewish homesteaders and grew up in Homestead Park. So our Homestead Bywise, yep. Our friend Ed said, Squirrel Hill, I believe, may be the first middle-class urban community in the country to take steps to prevent decay in its neighborhood and to work for improvements and solutions before a crisis prevails. He later reflected, looking back, I didn't want to move to the suburbs, and I think everyone else had the same feeling. We loved where we were. It was a grassroots effort. We knew if it got too bad, it would be too late. We raised money to rebuild the streets because Mary and Forbes were deteriorating. We got landlords to fix up their stores. Other projects they worked on were housing for old people and newlyweds, school planning, transportation, parking, police, and other municipal services. Squirrel had a lot of social capital and pre-existing organizations to leverage. SHUC was able to raise a large sum of money to begin operations. We know what happens next because we're sitting here. Enough people stayed. The community hung on, and we still have our business district. But it wasn't without its challenges, some of which came from the other side of the Mon, and all of this you know well. First, I'll just show you this quick population graph so you can see where we are through the 70s. Squirrel Hill's just starting to decline. Of course, they're looking at that and wondering, is that a dip or is that a beginning of a real slide? Homestead, of course, is well on the slide. So the Century 3 Mall opened on the far side of Homestead in 1979. It drew shopping away from Squirrel Hill. And then the steel mill in Homestead was torn down in the 90s and was replaced by an even larger shopping complex than the Century 3 called the Waterfront, which also drew shopping away from Squirrel Hill. In fact, the Waterfront Mall was specifically built based on the presence of the nearby affluent neighborhoods of Shadyside and Squirrel Hill. The complex is in fact inaccessible from the immediate neighborhoods. You can't get there from the main part of Homestead. You can't get there from West Homestead. I mean, don't get me started, those train tracks, I mean, that's failed activism going all the way back. So the waterfront provided much needed tax revenue for the 3 boroughs. But Squirrel Hill, 1990 to 2010, we see the closing of a lot of stores, in part because of generational turnover, and in large part because of the competition of the malls, which were the trendier way to shop in those days. I know, because where I grew up was where the first indoor mall was in the whole country. Of course, now Century 3 is condemned, and Waterfront's big box stores are struggling, so maybe, despite the internet, the balance will shift once more back to the kinds of niche local stores that Squirrel Hill excels at. I'll give you one last graph. This is where we end up. I'm missing some of the Squirrel Hill data, but you can see Squirrel Hill's population is sharply down from its peak Homestead also continued its slide, but is somewhat stabilized. And in some ways, the populations are a lot closer than I might have guessed before I was looking at it. So in the end, it was the place with the uneuphemistic name that became the more harmonious place. Homestead's lovely, evocative name connects with so little that actually happened there, except for the warm feelings that many of the people who live there retain for their very imperfect town. We are sitting here today likely have relationships with both of these places. Many of us probably live in the Squirrel Hill neighborhood, but we surely shop or seek entertainment in Homestead. There may be a little bridge and a water pipe connecting the two communities, but I hope you can see that there's a lot more to this story. Squirrel Hill and Homestead have been trading community and commerce for years. From the vantage point of, from today's vantage point, where does this leave us today? We should think about the ways in which Homestead has been left behind, and how that has so much to do with the ways that Squirrel Hill has continually been able to evolve. Ultimately, what determines where we live and how we live? Well, first and foremost, geography. This whole story derives from the hill of Squirrel Hill and the wide, flat riverbank opposite it. Beyond geography, our communities are shaped by transportation, industry, government, forces that feel like they're much bigger than us. But where we live and how we live is also shaped by people and their institutions, that being that which arises from the relationships that we have with each other. So, when both of these places worked for their residents, it was when the residents lobbied together for their shared needs, whether it was demanding better water or getting in front of urban decline. But we're a part of more than just the one community in which we live. Yes, local action is what matters, but I hope what this talk demonstrates is that what is local is more than just the streets of our own neighborhood. And neighbors are more than just the people on those streets immediately around us, surrounding us. So thank you.
Homestead, of course, never became part of the city. When did Squirrel Hill become part of Pittsburgh?
Ah, good. This is my favorite story to tell. And I came another time, so now I'm going to go over time by telling what I cut.
Tammy,
So,
please repeat the question.
I'll read the question. So the question was, Homestead didn't become a part of Pittsburgh. When did Squirrel Hill? So Squirrel Hill became a part of 1868. Homestead did not become a part, but it's not to say that Pittsburgh did not try repeatedly. I could give an entire hour-long talk on just that. Repeatedly, Pittsburgh tried to change laws in order to figure out a way of getting not just Homestead, but all of those boroughs. There is a great political cartoon that shows all of people from these boroughs carrying flags, marching on Harrisburg to tell the state legislators in Harrisburg, don't listen to those people from Pittsburgh, we don't want to be part of them. So they call Greater Pittsburgh an octopus. And for decades, they were successfully trying to fight off becoming part of Pittsburgh. Of course, now it's an interesting question with where all of these small boroughs are, if things wouldn't be better now if they weren't part of a larger shared government system, rather than each borough trying to figure it out for its own. But certainly at that time, there was no reason to believe that, even a borough like Homestead, which had its issues, was going to be better off as part of Pittsburgh. So I wish I had left the political cartoon in the deck so I could show you. It's really sort of fun. But that's the story. Homestead, not for lack of trying, but never became part of Pittsburgh. Question?
Two things. I was surprised that the waterfront didn't encourage business on the main street, West Avenue. Is that it?
8th Avenue.
8th Avenue.
Yeah.
8th Avenue. Number one. And then just recently I happened to go back and forth to Kennywood, and I see that there are some nice stores. They're really trying.
Yeah,
So
there's a lot.
maybe we should patronize them.
There's a lot of there's a lot going on 8th Avenue, which I think a lot of people here today would enjoy.
Yeah.
But if you drive deeper into Homestead, you'll see that those effects are not past spreading into the community. So yes, support Homestead in the stores because those tax dollars help the community, but there's still much bigger problems there that it's a much more difficult question. How can we help everybody in Homestead and not just sort of some of the new shops that are coming in? Which is not to say, by the way, that I haven't done yoga in that yoga studio or gone to that coffee shop.
Yeah, the coffee shop.
But when I drive around looking at, where all the old homes are that I'm looking at, I see a very different place from some of the transformation that you see on 8th Avenue. Question?
Yeah, when you were doing the bar graphs about Homestead population, was that just Homestead Borough or the 3 boroughs?
Yeah, I had a kind of a footnote there. So Homestead was the 3 boroughs, and Squirrel Hill I was using just word 14. So you can discuss whether that was right, but that's what I did.
How did the railroad still maintain the shut-off if you can't get into the
Right.
shopping center?
Right, so some of the history of that is, if you think about the way the town looked before they tore down the lower part, people had to cross those railroad tracks just to like do their shopping or visit their cousin who lived across the street. So it was exactly as bad as you would think that it would be, and there was in fact a lot of attempted local activism to figure out a solution, whether there was going to be an overpass or they would change the grade. But they never succeeded. That was a case where the town was simply not powerful enough to force the railroad companies into creating a safer situation. If that had happened back when there were more people living, then we wouldn't have this massive divide there now. But certainly now it's hard to justify, with like the freight industry being what it is and the town being what it is, how to do something about those tracks. But you're right, it would take a lot of money and ingenuity to do something about those railroad tracks now, and there needs to be the political will to do it. And certainly at the time that they were building the shopping center, they were writing off the top part of the town and just figuring out what do you do with this sort of giant expanse of empty land at the bottom.
They built a new shopping center, and then they built it all like the Key Sport, and all the little boroughs had, trains running through it. That's what they built.
Yeah. Question in the back?
How philanthropic was industry in Homestead?
Oh, my goodness. You could have an entire play about that. In fact, there's going to be one. The question was how philanthropic was industry in Homestead? Depends what you call philanthropy. So Carnegie would say he was very philanthropic. He built a giant library with a music hall, athletic clubs. It was largely empty most of the time. The people who frequented it weren't the people who needed it the most. They simply didn't have the waking hours to be there. And there's sort of a famous quote from the time where people said, we'd rather they had just given us the money instead. Because the philanthropy of the time was someone like Carnegie saying, I know what these people need. I'm going to pay them subsistence wages, but they need a library. But who had time to go to the library? You see throughout the history of Homestead that the industrialists are called upon to do small things. Frick donates an organ or piano, I forget which, maybe it was really his daughter doing it in his name. There's a Schwab industrial training school where people in the town are able to go. So those things are happening, but it's certainly a very different mode of philanthropy, which is what we believe today to be the ideal form, which we'll come back in a generation and find out we're wrong today. So a lot of what happened, because of course there wasn't a social safety net that we think of in that era, was in fact that a lot of the leading people of the town were expected to do their share. So when there are real economic downturns, you see the businessmen getting together and figuring out like how to raise money and then dole out families to what they called the worthy poor. So like if your husband was an alcoholic, you deserved to starve because your husband wasn't supporting you. But that's how they managed it in those days. So it really took the better off people in the town to look out for or not look out for other people there. The truth is it's really hard to know, looking at the sources that survive, how well that did. I mean, it looks really good on paper. I read these articles in the paper and I have all the warm and fuzzies because I know a lot of these merchants are Jewish merchants, and here they are working with the non-Jewish merchants in this incredible cooperation in this economic downturn, but it's really difficult to know if it made a difference. And the truth is, when people are paying subsistence wages, there is not a lot. And now they aren't working at all because there's, a panic or whatever. There's not a lot that an individual can do to change that. So, the short answer is there was stuff going on, but it was hard for it to make a difference. I mean, just by looking at the numbers, it was the return of the union that made a real difference in the lives of people being able to not just be able to support themselves, but have the opportunities to better themselves, whether that was within the mill or being able to get out of the mill and follow a different kind of path.
What was the secret to Squirrel Hill's water quality?
Oh, I mean, I know less about it because I'm looking at it from the Homestead side, but, wherever they were getting it, they had a filtration plant. Homestead had a pipe, had a pipe that went directly into the river, and I cannot tell you how many times they sent out a scuba diver because it got clogged. And I mean, think about how good scuba gear was in those days. I mean, this is crazy work.
More from the Allegheny River.
Could be, I know less about this. I just know that they had a very special water filtration plant, which meant that all the gunk wasn't being passed on, and in Homestead it went straight through the pipe. Hence all the mud, the chemicals, everything else. So that was the difference. That was the difference maker, and other people here might know more about that. I really only know about it from the Homestead side. Hand in the back.
I find it hard to believe that the population of Squirrel Hill has fallen. Why? What do you attribute that to? I mean, the housing stock remains pretty much the same, if not increased with some apartment buildings.
So I'm hearing murmurings of fewer children. So there's, so that's probably one reason. Everyone here has a theory. People can call them out.
Well, it's the suburbs being
The
built.
suburbs were a draw for people. We've got a.
Yeah, I want to say that the population has been increasing recently.
Yeah,
It
they
is
wanna
for
come back.
sure. I mean, I think if you consider what was going on with the steel industry in the 80s and the 90s, and then maybe it stops falling, but it stagnates, I really feel like, and maybe it's sample bias because I've only been here 5 years, but I think that we'll see in the most recent census, which will be happening any day now. Don't forget your census. It needs to go into this bar graph. I think we're probably going to see those numbers starting to come back. But I would imagine for those of you who were here, you probably have a palpable sense of what the feeling was like at that time and people you knew who were leaving. Yeah, I'm surprised it hasn't rebounded more just looking at the graph.
But for everyone leaving, someone's moving in because the housing stock remains pretty much constant.
That's right.
All I can say is these are the numbers from the census.
No, household sizes are way down.
Household sizes are way down.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's the kids. Yeah. Okay.
The size of households, the number of children.
Yeah,
We can't hear a ramp.
the question was why didn't they build a ramp above the railroad? Like, my guess is they just didn't care. My guess is they saw an open patch of land and a company bought it and wanted to make money off of it and took one look at who the shoppers could be and thought they don't need to just drive all the way out to Century 3, they can stop here. And I think they looked at the town and wrote it off as are these people going to make money for us? No, okay, they're not interesting. I mean, I don't mean to be cynical about it, but I just think they looked at the landscape and thought what was worth spending money on and what wasn't, and that's why it is what it is. And certainly at the time, there wasn't the perspective of activists in the community or activists outside of the community asking for a different topography in order to incorporate the two areas, because you can imagine a very different kind of a project which could reconnect Homestead where people live with the commercial part and completely change the fortunes of what's going on the hill. I'm not an urban planner. There are people here who know a lot more about this.
You have to remember there are not just one railroad, there are two. One was the Pennsylvania Railroad, which is headquartered in Philadelphia and had sort of an unofficial seat in the Senate.
Yes.
And when the
50%
Senate
of
voted
it.
for things, they looked to that Pennsylvania Railroad official first. Okay, so, then you have the federal railroad laws about who has the right to say whether you have a bridge. And take a look at the size of the ward. So you're coming off Brown's Bridge. Now you're ramping over two railroads, two permissions.
Brown's
and
Bridge
you
didn't
don't
ramp
have
over.
very much room to come down into 8th Avenue. So
Brownsville's Bridge, to be clear, hit directly at the riverbank. So people would routinely get all the way backed up because when the trains came through, imagine if you couldn't cross the high-level bridge because a train was passing. Hence the high-level bridge, because it went over the tracks.
Coming out of the
You're
water.
absolutely right about the power that the railroad companies had, and that's why no individual borough, for the most part, you do see places where they are able to get overpasses. When you drive around, start to notice where you see these overpasses over railroad tracks. You do see them, but it was very hard for individual boroughs to be able to be successful with that, because you're right, there was an incredible power balance.
Yeah, now there's a huge federal and state push to get rid of all railroad crossings. You have so many drivers, so many accidents, so much money going out in claims. But back then, McKeesport was another town. They had 3 railroads, 10 tracks, and that crossing was called the Death Track.
Yeah. I mean, I could give a whole talk about all the people on the
I mean, I
Homestead
know the
tracks.
streetcar company built its own trestle to get over that.
Yeah. It's a question up here.
When you compared the two, Squirrel Hill and Homestead, did you find really clear distinctions, differences between development of education opportunities in each?
Yes.
And
That's
what were they, if you could say?
I think I think people living in a steel town, when the steel mill is active, were very much focused, especially in the union era, that the mill is good jobs and the mill is guaranteed employment.
Amen.
And my father was in the mill, and my grandfather was in the mill, and I want to go into the mill. So a cousin of mine, for example, who was born in the late 20s, so he actually did work in the steel mill in the 40s, but he remembers people in high school would look out the window down to the steel mill and say, I don't even know why I'm here, I'm going to be working there. So in a steel mill community where you know that there is a place of employment where you can live a comfortable life, education looks different. In Squirrel Hill, you have a couple of different things going on. First of all, there's no obvious local industry. There's no sort of like multi-generational, like here is where my prosperity is going to come from. You also have the fact that there's a much larger Jewish community, which has its own perspective on the importance of education. And especially for Jews coming in, especially in Squirrel Hill, you see that first generation who are hucksters, smaller merchants, the second generation maybe merchants also, but there is an incredible, incredible push where kids are going to college, kids are going into the professions, kids are having white-collar jobs. You know, even their fathers who made more money than they ever did in a store, they're not even going into the store. So it's just a very different way of looking at the opportunities that are available and figuring out how do you get there. So one case, education isn't necessary, the jobs are available. In the other case, the jobs that are considered desirable, you have to have a certain level of education for. And so the thing that's interesting to me in Homestead, where you do have a sizable Jewish community, who in some ways some do work for the steel mill, but largely they don't, and they're sort of bucking the trend in the town, is that when you live in a steel mill town, there's an attitude of what is like real work. Real work is manly work. Real work is physical work. So I don't have a real sense of it, but I wonder what it's like for a Jewish kid who's growing up who knows that his parents want him to go to high school, which is rare in those days, go to college, have a certain kind of job, and yet you're going to high school with people who are defining real work as something quite different from what you're being trained to do. So on the one hand, we might think the world being what it is today, that a kid who has all the support to go to high school and college and get a white-collar job, like that kid's superior. But I actually think that growing up in a steel town, you're probably getting a mix of things. You're probably being surrounded by people who are actually telling you what you're doing isn't going to be real work. This is real work. So it's complicated, and I haven't really, like, I've started putting together some of the numbers to see, like, are Jewish kids disproportionately going to high school at an age in which everybody didn't go to high school, or Jewish kids disproportionately going to college in an age where, again, college wasn't universal, but I don't really have enough to say. I'm sure people have done these studies in other areas, but that's just some of what I've been able to pick up along the way.
Yeah, I so much appreciated your telling the story of Munhall and Homestead and the split, and how the poor people carry the weight of the town and the rich people got the benefits from taxes of the mill. The same thing happened in Edgewood, Swissville, Union Switch and Signal, where I used to work. Edgewood carved out that. The only thing that Swissville got was the main gate, so as Mayor Martoni used to say, we had to do the snow removal. They got all the taxation.
Wow, that's really extreme.
And that happened in Braddock and North Braddock. North Braddock carved out the entire mill, got all the tax money. In North Braddock, the lower wards got virtually nothing. The Slavic wards got very little benefit, tax benefit from the mills. And this balkanization of the Mon Valley. I think we used to have in the West to West Coalition 26 communities from West Homestead to West Elizabeth, and that was all done by the steel mills to gerrymander, both break up political power and also not pay taxes,
right,
by offloading taxes on the poor areas and keeping it from the rich areas. And it's extraordinary that a place like Homestead, which is producing wealth unimaginable, the most productive steel mill in the world, making literally millions of dollars for hundreds of people, would also have the most abject poverty, and the need for public services then is the greatest, but they don't pay.
Right. I mean, right. So what you're saying, which connects to what this gentleman was saying as well, is you have these sorts of systems in which people who have more power, there's, we talk about people power, but what can people power do in the face of that? And, to your point, giving all these other examples where there was tax gerrymandering, I mean, these were things they were very practiced in doing. They knew how to hang on to that power. And in fact, it took a Great Depression and a very activist kind of president to create some of the changes that begin to switch that. But of course, we're living in a that was a golden age that has,
And
we're not where we're at right
unionization
now.
and the GI Bill, I believe, doubled the real wages of Pittsburgh industrial workers from 1945 to 1960, doubled them, and also pushed up all the professional wages in downtown who had to keep up with the mill workers getting a decent vacation, getting medical care, getting a decent wage. So unionization and the GI Bill was incredibly.
I appreciate your mention of the GI Bill, and I also appreciate, I hope what people heard, mentioning that, as Charlie was saying, the wages were getting so good in the mill that there, every other profession, even professions that we would think of today as, surely they had to have been higher paying professions, but as Charlie was saying, they had to keep up with those benefits.
So what is the answer? Why did the mills close? Why did they move?
Oh, we could have a very globalization, the role of the union.
Because the union workers asked for birthdays off.
Oh, it sounds like everyone's done, so thank you very much.